immediately staking a claim in the center. This pawn push opens vital diagonals for your bishops and queen, creating dynamic possibilities right from the start. Instantly establishing a pawn chain, Black sets up a battle for central influence and asymmetry from the outset. Developing the knight here prepares for central pawn pushes and stakes a claim in the battle for the d4 square. Establishing pawn control in the center, this move prepares for further development and offers flexibility for Black's pieces. Immediately challenging the center, this pawn thrust ignites a fascinating struggle for central space and piece activity. By removing the central pawn and opening lines, Black invites a dynamic clash, immediately challenging White's ambitious pawn push and setting the stage for sharp play. Nabbing the center pawn opens lines for swift piece development, aiming for immediate central influence and rapid initiative. Developing the knight to f6 directly contests the central d4 pawn, setting up a typical Sicilian defense structure with active piece play. This knight's repositioning exerts pressure on the center, preparing for a pawn storm or piece development towards the king side. Securing the b5 square preemptively, this move gently reshapes the pawn structure for future maneuvering. A solid step towards controlling central squares, aiming to support further piece development and potentially prepare a kingside pawn storm, while also preventing Black's intended b5 advance by offering prophylaxis. Preparing to support the d5 advance, Black aims to develop the queen's bishop and potentially contest the center. This cautious setup, while solid, surrenders some central initiative and can lead to slightly cramped positions if White plays energetically. Bringing the queen to d2 offers a flexible platform, potentially supporting a kingside pawn storm with f4 or preparing to connect the rooks. Black aims to seize queenside space and disrupt White's development, but risks weakening their pawn structure on that flank if the advance isn't supported properly. Solidifying the center and preventing counterplay on the d4 square, this move prepares for potential kingside expansion with g4, while also shoring up the pawn structure against any immediate queenside threats Black might have envisioned. Building out the kingside defensive wall with the knight now anchors a crucial square and prepares for potential pawn pushes, aiming to solidify Black's structure and facilitate development of the kingside pieces. Launching a bold pawn storm on the kingside, White aggressively seeks to disrupt Black's queenside expansion and create attacking chances, though it potentially weakens the king's shelter. Parrying the intended kingside storm, Black preemptively shores up the dark squares and prevents the knight's potential jump to g5, though this defensive maneuver concedes valuable space on the kingside and delays crucial counterplay. Unleashing the king's side defense, this castling maneuver boldly stakes its claim on the queenside open files, preparing for an imminent pawn storm and increasing the pressure on Black's uncastled monarch. Developing the bishop to this square reinforces control over the long diagonal and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the queenside, while simultaneously offering the bishop as a defensive shield against White's kingside pawn storm. Strategically, bringing the bishop to d3 solidifies the kingside defense by adding another guardian to the vulnerable g2 square, while also preparing to potentially support a future pawn push on the kingside. This centralized piece eyes the long diagonal, influencing squares like f5 and e4, and can even pivot to c2 if needed for further kingside safety or to reroute. The intent is clear: to consolidate White's position and prepare for the inevitable skirmishes that will erupt given the aggressive pawn structures already in place. Unleashing the knight to e5 ignites a fascinating dynamic, aiming to disrupt White's kingside pawn storm and exploit the slight awkwardness of the queen on d2. This maneuver creates immediate pressure on the d3 bishop, forcing a decision and potentially opening lines for Black's pieces. It's a bold declaration that Black isn't passively defending, but actively seeking counterplay. Bringing the rook into the central fray on the open e-file, White aims to bolster their central pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances, while simultaneously eyeing Black's king's safety, which might become a more pressing concern if the center opens further. Launching the rook to c8 immediately puts pressure on the c-file, preparing to contest its control and potentially exploit the pawn structure after further exchanges, while simultaneously reinforcing the knight on e5 and eyeing potential infiltration squares. The monarch tucks away, seeking sanctuary from the open files and the lurking dangers that can arise when the queenside pawn storm gains momentum. Shifting the bishop to the rim might seem passive, but it opens lines for a potential queenside pawn storm and supports the knight at e5 while also preparing to connect the rooks, reinforcing the defensive structure against white's aggressive pawn advance. Aggressively advancing the kingside pawn storm, 14. h4 is a bold attempt to unseal the h-file and disrupt black's defensive structure around the king, aiming to create immediate attacking chances even if it means weakening white's own kingside pawn cover. A bold challenge for space on the queenside, aiming to dislodge the knight and potentially open lines, though it risks weakening the pawn chain and creating overextension. Unleashing the knight to the rim, white aims to disrupt black's queenside ambitions while creating a flexible attacking piece, hinting at a potential repositioning towards c5 or b6 to control key squares, and forcing black to consider how their own knight on e5 will be challenged. Challenging white's queenside pawn advance, black immediately targets the vulnerable knight on a4, seeking to disrupt white's spatial advantage and create counterplay. The pawn push b3 attempts to solidify the queenside structure and prevent further black incursions, but it weakens the c3 square and creates potential targets on the queenside diagonals, especially for black's active bishop on b7. The knight repositions to d7, a subtle but strategic maneuver that bolsters the central pawn chain and prepares for future pawn pushes, perhaps d5 or e5, while also providing a defensive retreat if needed. This knight also eyes the weak squares on the queenside that white's advanced pawns have created. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white escalates the aggression, aiming to shatter black's defensive pawn chain and expose the king. This bold pawn thrust is designed to open lines for white's pieces and generate immediate threats, forcing black into a defensive posture where every move will be critical. The strategic intent is clear: create chaos and exploit any positional weaknesses that emerge from the ensuing pawn exchange, potentially leading to a swift attack on the monarch. A crucial defensive maneuver, g6 seeks to solidify the king's shelter and restrict the advancing white pawn's rampage. By creating a pawn chain anchored by this piece, black aims to build a resilient fortress, daring white's aggressive intentions to find a weak point. The ambition here is to absorb the pressure, hoping to later counterattack on the queenside or through the center once white's attacking momentum inevitably wanes. This solidifies black's position against the immediate threats, but might also lead to a more cramped position for the black pieces if white can maintain control of the open files. Unleashing an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, white sacrifices pawn structure for attacking momentum, daring black to embrace the ensuing complications while simultaneously pushing black's queen to the brink of tactical exposure. Exchanging the knight on d3 immediately alters the pawn structure and opens the f-file, creating potential for future aggressive play. Black surrenders a developed piece that was well placed to contest the d4 square, potentially weakening their central control. This exchange simplifies the position somewhat, but it's crucial to see if black can leverage the newly cleared diagonal for their bishop, or if white can exploit the open lines around their king. Consider how this frees up the queen and rook on the queenside for white's attack. Opening the c-file offers black immediate counterplay, potentially exposing your king's defenses as the center cracks open, forcing a sharp tactical battle. Embracing the opening of the h-file, black initiates a bold confrontation, sacrificing material not for immediate gain, but to shatter white's imposing pawn wedge and expose the monarch's sanctuary. Opening the h-file like this forces a strategic reevaluation of the kingside's integrity, potentially creating unforeseen weaknesses around your monarch while offering a glimmer of hope for counterplay through the newly liberated pathway. Unlocking the central d-file with this pawn thrust creates a critical point of contention, forcing white to decide whether to embrace the ensuing tactical chaos or solidify their structure. Black is bravely inviting complications, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn storm and potentially exploit the open lines that arise. unleashing a bold pawn sacrifice to shatter black's defensive pawn chain and pry open the kingside. This move gambles on creating immediate attacking chances and disrupting black's development, potentially exposing the monarch. Unleashing the pawn storm abruptly halts its advance, recognizing that the central tension now becomes paramount as black seeks to break the stranglehold. A sharp tactical pivot is initiated, aiming to shatter black's defensive pawn structure and exploit the newly opened diagonal for white's pieces. This capture doesn't just remove a defender, it actively pries open the E file, creating immediate threats against the black king's central sanctuary and inviting a cascade of tactical possibilities. Instead of settling for quiet development, white embraces a bold sacrifice, understanding that the ensuing complications can lead to a crushing attack if black doesn't respond with pinpoint accuracy. The strategic intent is to create imbalance and force black onto the back foot, capitalizing on the compromised pawn chain and aiming for a swift initiative. This move signals a willingness to engage in a tactical melee, prioritizing dynamic play over positional solidity, with the hope of overwhelming black's defenses through aggressive piece play. Black seizes the initiative by reclaiming the pawn, opening lines and activating the queen, though it momentarily exposes it to white's central pawn chain and potential tactical skirmishes. Unleashing a potent pawn storm aimed at the black king, this advance dramatically escalates the conflict on the kingside, seeking to pry open lines for white's attacking pieces. Black sacrifices a tempo and develops their bishop to a square where it can be easily harassed by white's advancing pawns, rather than contesting the central space or reinforcing their pawn structure, potentially opening lines for white's kingside attack. Securing the knight's outpost on c2, this maneuver aims to reposition the piece to a more active square, potentially e3, and to alleviate the pressure on the d4 pawn while also preparing for further pawn advances on the kingside, such as f5, to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king. Unleashing the queenside pawn storm, 24. a5 ignites a critical race to disrupt white's kingside castle and pry open lines against the beleaguered monarch. This aggressive push aims to exploit the queenside space advantage and create dynamic imbalances, forcing white into a defensive posture and potentially exposing weaknesses in their pawn structure. It's a bold gambit to seize the initiative before white can solidify their attacking potential. The bishop's repositioning to a7 seizes a vital outpost, aiming to control the long diagonal and prepare for potential raids on the queenside, while simultaneously disrupting black's pawn structure. Relocating the king to a safer square is a sensible priority when the queenside pawn structure has been weakened and the center is on the brink of collapse. A tactical sidestep, e3 aims to dislodge the bishop from its commanding diagonal and simultaneously prepare for a potential king hunt by repositioning the knight to a more active square, perhaps supporting a pawn push or creating threats against the black monarch. Unleashing the queen to the central arena offers a double-edged sword, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety while risking exposure to future knight forays. The positional integrity of the pawn chain now hinges on black's ability to outmaneuver the vigilant queen. Clearing the central e-file with the knight redeployment opens lines for tactical action and repositions the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting d6 or preparing for a queenside advance. A tactical retreat to consolidate the king's position, seeking safety behind the newly formed pawn shield amidst the encroaching storm of white's aggressive setup. Unlocking the c-file's potential with this knight sacrifice injects immediate tactical life into a rather static position, forcing a reevaluation of both king's safety and the interconnectedness of the remaining pieces. A significant reshuffle begins as the queen re-engages on the central action, seeking to stabilize the position amidst the looming pawn storm and black's exposed king. Venturing the knight to its landing spot on b2 aims to secure a central foothold, potentially eyeing the c4 square for future pressure or preparing a retreat to a safer, more active position if the queenside structure collapses. Unleashing a pawn storm often leaves vulnerabilities, and black's kingside is now exposed to white's advanced pieces and potential breakthroughs along the open files. Re-establishing the knight's presence on c4 suddenly reignites the pressure on the d6 pawn and offers a potential outpost, aiming to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain and perhaps prepare a breakthrough. Reasserting pressure on the d-file, this knight seeks to disrupt white's central grip and potentially open new avenues for attack. The aggressive pawn push on the king side has created weaknesses, and this repositioning aims to exploit them by creating dynamic imbalances. A tactical reset is initiated, aiming to untangle a cramped position by forcing exchanges, though it risks simplifying into a less favorable structure. Black repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially preparing to support advances on the queen side or to contest the open d-file. This rook repositioning aims to activate the piece by shifting it from its passive defensive post. Considering the current board state, where the queens are off, this move can be interpreted as white preparing for a potential pawn push with the kingside pieces, or perhaps anticipating a future skirmish along the central files. It's a subtle repositioning, allowing the rook to potentially either 7th rank or support a central breakthrough should the opportunity arise. The knights have been dancing around each other, and this might be white's attempt to add a bit more concrete pressure, shifting the game away from the current, somewhat static maneuvering. The queenside initiative black has been nurturing now faces a crucial test, as repositioning the queen to a6 suddenly opens lines for white's rooks and threatens to dismantle black's pawn structure with a well-timed discovered attack, or even a direct assault on the d6 pawn. Unleashing a tactical storm, this exchange on the c-file fundamentally alters the pawn structure and opens new avenues for attack. A necessary sacrifice to break open the queenside and create a passed pawn, even at the cost of opening lines towards your own king. Clearing the d-file now grants white a decisive open line for their remaining rook, turning the queenside pawn structure into a potential weakness for black's king, which appears exposed. Pouncing on the now exposed queen, black seeks immediate simplification through this capture, a daring gambit to disrupt white's lingering initiative before their king can find solid shelter. Clearing that central pawn allows your rook to finally dominate the open c-file, a crucial positional advantage now that black's queen is restricted, and their king looks increasingly exposed on the queen side. Black aims to centralize the queen and create potential threats against the white king, but doing so on the d4 square leaves it exposed to attack from white's knight and rook. Seizing the opportunity presented by the exposed black monarch, white pounces on the weakened queenside structure, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the open files for a swift attack. The king, now exposed, forces a frantic attempt to escape the immediate danger. Repositioning the knight to c2 aims to regroup and possibly reroute to a more active square, perhaps d4 or e4, as the king's safety remains a paramount concern, especially with the queens now off the board and the d3 pawn potentially becoming a target. Unleashing a rook to the 2nd rank, black injects immediate life into the h-file, threatening to exploit the exposed white king and disrupt white's now fragmented queenside pawns. King's safety abruptly evaporates as the monarch is exposed to a sweeping diagonal threat, initiating a decisive chase. Black attempts to escape the immediate attack and re-establish some defensive order, but the king remains exposed to the powerful queen and bishop battery. Unleashing the rook to pierce through black's defenses, this maneuver aims to sever the connection between the king and its protecting pieces, creating immediate attacking opportunities on the now exposed diagonal and potentially leading to a swift checkmate. Unleashing a final desperate gambit, black sacrifices the rook to disrupt white's queen's dominance and potentially expose the monarch. Navigating this exposed king requires extreme caution, as a single misstep could lead to a swift checkmate. The black queen, having traversed the board, now eyes the exposed white king, a tempting target after the king's recent shuffle to safety. Suddenly, the focus shifts to the exposed black king. White's rook transplantation to the 8th rank effectively isolates black's monarch, preventing it from finding any safe haven amidst the remaining pawns. This aggressive repositioning aims to capitalize on the king's current precarious situation, setting the stage for a potential decisive attack, by bringing more firepower into the immediate vicinity. The ensuing play will likely revolve around exploiting the king's lack of defensive resources and white's ability to create mating threats. Reevaluating the king's safety on the now open diagonal after the queen's excursion, black must consider how to consolidate their position and prepare for a potential endgame where white's advanced pawns might become a factor. The rook repositions to the 8th rank, aiming to exploit the vulnerable king and potentially trap the black pieces with coordinated pressure along the open files. The black king, exposed on the queen side, finds a glimmer of hope, as this tempo-gaining check disrupts white's previously consolidated position and forces the powerful rook back to a less active square. The king bolts towards the queen side, seeking an escape from the mating net, but it's a desperate flight into potentially more dangerous territory. Securing the king's escape route towards the queen side offers a welcome respite from the relentless pressure white has applied, allowing black a moment to regroup and assess the increasingly tense material imbalance and exposed nature of his monarch. The rook's forceful thrust opens the floodgates towards black's vulnerable monarch, simultaneously creating a powerful battery on the F-file that threatens to dismantle the defensive structure. The black king is suddenly exposed, and this discovered check attempts to force a reprieve, disrupting white's attacking momentum before the material deficit becomes insurmountable. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential becomes paramount as white aggressively advances it, seeking to disrupt black's king and exploit the open lines created by recent exchanges.